All right, everybody. Welcome to this month's National Extension Climate Initiative Professional Development Webinar. We are recording this particular session, and there will be a very short poll as soon as Jennifer is finished with the presentation portion of her talk. There will also be a survey link that we will put in the chat at the conclusion for our impact reporting, so we appreciate everybody keeping that in mind. As always, the snacks and restrooms are where you last left them, and that's the last of my logistics before I introduce Jennifer Wightman, whose bio reads, for the last 2 decades, she has focused on systems-based greenhouse gas mitigation strategies. Building on her background in environmental toxicology and risk assessment, she uses systems thinking to consider equitable design and decision-making to reduce net greenhouse gas emissions that meaningfully reduce changes to global climate. And with that, Jennifer, thank you for speaking today.
Thanks for having me, Hans, and thanks for all of you joining today. I'm going to talk about our smart decision matrix that we developed in New York State so that we could begin to think about how to prioritize greenhouse gas mitigation strategies on working lands. But first, I want to share an issue I have with climate change. To me, that this is a very passive framing, and in fact, and I want us to flip the script on it, right? It assumes sort of a passive acceptance of a phenomena. Oh, there's going to be extreme weather or increased insurance premiums or food insecurity, or we're going to lose habitat and species. And yet we ourselves are actively changing things. And so when you run out of cookies, you make some more. When your compost bucket is full, you take it out. When you have a leak in the roof, you put a bucket under it, you look at your finances, you try to figure out how to fix it. And that's kind of the framework that I take pragmatically throughout my work. And so the next step I want to share with you is sort of some artistic paintings that have been made in the United States in the 1800s to show how we've been actively changing the landscape. So in this case, you can see this painting from 1826, and you can see in the foreground some redbacks, and they are fighting over this territory. But there's a huge amount of resources relative to the landscape at large. Here you can see on the left-hand side, the wild, but you can see the beginning of agriculture on the right. Here you can see one house in the landscape and another person sort of prospecting. Here someone is bringing home the cows. And here you can see trains and communities, and in the foreground, you can see deforestation. And this is the beginning of what I want to point out. If you look at the year, this is 1856. Technically, this is not from New York. This is from Pennsylvania. But this is a chart of New York's changes in forest. New York is roughly 30 million acres, and historically, we were mostly forested. But by around the same time of this painting, we were almost only 5 million acres of forest in our state. And I just want to connect that realistically to this chart, which is a US chart of energy consumption. And you can see it around that time, wood was our major source of energy. And then since then, we've been using all of this ancient photosynthesis, all of this old biomass in the form of these blue fossil fuel components. Right? And so every time we pull up a gallon, we're releasing CO2 to the atmosphere that was in the atmosphere in a long time ago, but it is changing our current climate. So my point here is that we've actively changed the climate, but we are reflective and thinking species, and we are tracking our impact. And we have research, policies, funding, and people to make a difference. And we are not the first ones to do this. So in New York State, we had a cholera outbreak in the 1800s, and it was because we weren't treating our sewage. We were having these horse carts move across New York City, and drop it in the East River or drop it in the Hudson River. And we had a cholera outbreak. And so we've done many things to address things like cholera, like building sewage treatment plants. And in fact, I like to joke that our first sewage treatment in New York City is located in Flushing, New York. But we also have fun projects like up at Syracuse University, where they're making experimental wetlands for addressing wastewater. And likewise, in the late 60s, we had rivers that were on fire. And we came up with policies like the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act to fix those. I also want to point out that in 1937, there was this whole rural electrification campaign in order to bring electricity to our rural communities, along with our running water for heating, cooling, and for farm work. And then my last little piece of personal information is when I was a child, we would drive to New Jersey. I grew up in New Hampshire, rural New Hampshire, and it would take us about 8 hours, and we did not have iPads. So my father had me be in charge of the road map. And one of my favorite things about these road maps, sorry, this resolution is bad, is that if you looked at the map legend, you could see these dashed lines, which represented roads not yet built in our country, but they were coming, they were planned. And this is my point. Past generations did these things for us. So what will we do for those that come after? We change things, and what I'm trying to promote here is that we really change things. So how do we do it? Well, we have an overarching mandate in New York State. We have methods and mechanisms to deploy. We have a bunch of state and federal funding in New York. We have each other, including Cornell University, as well as other universities. And we continue to seek. We research, we ask questions, we explore, we test, we try, we fail, and we try again. And so I just want to give you a brief overview about the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which was passed in 2019 in New York State. You can read that legislation here. It's actually really easy to read, and it's informative. But the high-level content says that all sectors in New York State must reduce emissions by 40% by 2030, 85% by 2050, and to be net neutral by 2050. It has some other stipulations that there must not be a net increase in co-pollutants as we try to address the greenhouse gases, and that these changes be implemented with a clear recognition of social justice. And so one example is the QR code on the right for the New York State Department of Ag and Markets Working Group Diversity and Racial Equity report, which was released in 2021. So I'm just trying to show you how some of the policies on the left-hand side are promoting some documents on the right for all of us to review. It also mandates that we must minimize costs and maximize total benefits to encourage early action. And in order to identify what those costs are, New York State has come up with a recommended social cost of carbon. So that means that about now, right, everything that we can do for under $130 per metric ton of greenhouse gas mitigation saves future generations in costs caused by climate change, right? So this gives us an upper limit of how much we want to be spending in order to be accountable to future generations and the crisis that climate may cause them. Another one that I could talk a whole hour about are these key terms that are in the legislation. We must ensure that the greenhouse gas emissions reductions achieved are real, permanent, quantifiable, verifiable, and enforceable. These are really great words, and they merit some discussion. I'm not going to go into it today, but I just really encourage you to all pay attention to those words and try to laser in on the intent and meaning for delivering real, permanent, and verifiable mitigation, because we really do need to reduce our emissions if we're going to address changes to climate. So in summary, our New York State legislation has a 40% reduction in greenhouse gases from all sectors by 2030, 85% reduction by 2050, and to be net neutral in 2050. We have a scoping plan, and it is to be revised every 5 years, and the mitigation must be low cost, meaning less than $130 per metric ton, equitable both to current and future generations, not cause other sources of pollution, and must be real, permanent, measurable, and verifiable. But New York is not alone, right? There is the Climate Alliance, which started in 2015, and this map shows you other states with similar policies. And all of these states combined, I think it's 24 states, represents 54% of the US population and 57% of the US economy. So if you want to be inspired to see what your state is doing or what another state is doing, I highly recommend going here. Okay, so how do we reduce our emissions? Well, I'm effectively a greenhouse gas accountant. And so for me, that means figuring out what a baseline is. And is this baseline perfect? No, but it allows us to figure out what ballpark we're playing in. And so this is historic New York State emissions. This was a huge bunch of work by a whole bunch of different groups. And what you can see here, okay, these are the historic emissions from 1990 to 2020. But notably, we are 15% below our 1990 levels already. And so I just want everybody to say hooray, without even really trying, we have reduced our emissions in New York State. Notably, most of those emissions in New York State are coming from the energy sector. Waste is in the gray. Agriculture contributes 6% of our emissions and is in orange, and that's the part that Peter Woodbury and I were responsible for. And green is the sequestration. You'll notice it's below zero that is happening in our forests across the state. And this is also where we're going to get to the net neutral goal, but I'm not going to go into that today. But the point here is that agriculture contributes 6% of our emissions, and forestry is a sink, reducing and removing some of our emissions in the state. So where do we need to go? We need to get to 40% below 1990 by 2030 and 85% below 1990 by 2050. And so this is just a visual to help you see what 40% roughly looks like and what 85% looks like. And it is a bit daunting, I would agree. But New York State has a scoping plan that is revised every 5 years, but this is our first one. It's 445 pages, and you certainly don't need to read it all. You just need to go to the section that interests you. And here is the pie chart of emissions by sector. And I just think this is really important because there's a lot of stuff in the news that says lots of things about agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. And I just really want to point out that the majority of the emissions are coming from our buildings and our transportation in the state. And you'll see agriculture, which is in this pink section, is just 6% of our emissions. All right. And I just think that's an important distinction, that we all need to think about the other sectors, and that agriculture is a small piece of this larger pie. But nonetheless, we all have to reduce our emissions, including agriculture. So just a summary of the state inventory is most emissions are for buildings and transportation. Ag emissions are relatively small. Waste emissions are similar to fossil-based electric emissions. Forests are our major carbon sink, and New York State is already 15% below its 1990 levels. So that means we have to rally for another 25% to get to the 40% reduction by 2030. And I think we should all feel heartened by that. So now I'm going to pivot to a focus on agriculture. I'm going to have 3 subsections talking just briefly about the 3 key greenhouse gases in agriculture, then a brief overview of the US inventory, and then a focus down on the New York State ag inventory. So can we look at reducing agricultural emissions 40% by 2030 and under $130 per metric ton? So To do that, we need to first think about what are the key greenhouse gases in agriculture, and they are carbon dioxide, CO2, methane, CH4, and nitrous oxide, N2O. And why this is important is that they all have different potencies. Carbon dioxide is always considered a base unit of 1. And in New York State, we're using the global warming potential of 20 years from the IPCC AR5 report, which counts methane as 84 times as potent of a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide is 264 times as potent. Other older inventory use these different global warming potentials over here in gray for reference. So most state reporting is still using these numbers. New York State is using these numbers. Okay, so what is important here, it's not that agriculture is producing large quantities of methane and nitrous oxide. It's that these gases are really potent and their multiplier makes them appear to be more prevalent. And it's just because of their potency is coming through in the calculation. So if you think about 1 pound of nitrous oxide being released, it's equal to 264 pounds of carbon dioxide being released, right? So we have to really think about the interactions between carbon and nitrogen in our soils for this reason. When we do make this conversion, when we convert the gases, the tons of gas with the global warming potential, that's when we come to the CO2 equivalents or CO2e, okay? So now I'm going to pivot to the US total emissions by source, and what you'll see is that most of the emissions come in the blue piece of the pie in the United States, and that is from the energy sector. And you will see that agriculture is only 10% of the US's total emissions. Now I'm going to pull out this 10%, the red in this pie chart, in this bar chart. So what is in this 10% right here is now being pulled out by agricultural activity. And you will see that the largest one, it's actually off of this chart, right? This chart only goes up to 200 million metric tons, is nitrous oxide emissions from agricultural soil management. All right, so nitrous oxide is the most important for us to think about nationally in terms of greenhouse gases. Next important are methane and nitrous oxide from enteric fermentation, which is literally the cow's burps and farts or any kind of ruminant animal. And then the manure management, which is a combination of methane and nitrous oxide emissions. I don't point it out in this slide, but the remaining sources of emissions from ag across the country are small, and these are all CO2 sources. The point being here is that the majority of these emissions are from methane and nitrous oxide and not carbon dioxide. So while the rest of society needs to think about reducing carbon dioxide, when we're thinking in the ag sector, we need to think about reducing nitrous oxide and methane. So now I'm going to pivot to the results from New York State. So these are the results from our work in New York State. And the key finding is that methane from livestock is accounting for 86% of New York State's agricultural emissions. And you can see this is coming from the enteric fermentation from our livestock, as well as the manure management from that livestock. There's a little nitrous oxide from that manure management, some nitrous oxide from our soils, and then some carbon dioxide being released from our soils, lime and urea use in state. But again, I just want to point out that agriculture is only 6% of our total emissions, okay? So here comes my first common sense priority. As you're thinking about what to do in your state or on a particular farm. If you're working with a livestock farm or you have a high livestock stake, I recommend you think immediately about focusing in on methane. For example, New York State is the 4th largest dairy in New York State, and that kind of explains why methane is such an important component for our state. If you are working with a cropping farm or a farm or a state that is predominantly a cropping state, you really want to focus on nitrous oxide emissions from field use. And so, for example, the United States has almost 1 billion acres of agricultural land, and this sort of explains why nationally we need to think about nitrous oxide emissions. Okay, so now I'm going to show you New York State emissions as a time course. And what you can see here is 1990 on the bottom left and 2020 on the right. So unlike New York State at large, which has a 15% reduction, New York State agricultural emissions have a 41% increase in emissions over time. I'm not going to talk about the reasons why that is happening. I'm going to pivot really over to how we can decide what to do with these emissions and how to get them down strategically in our state. So this is the breakdown of all of those previous slides I've shown you about the emissions. So enteric emissions are about 14 million metric tons. Manure management is about 6 million metric tons. Field nitrogen emissions are about 2 million metric tons. And lime, urea, and soil organic carbon are another less than 1 million metric tons. So it's about 23 million metric tons. What is not included here is woodlands on sequestering carbon on farms. And what also is not included here is energy used on farms, but that's roughly about 2 million metric tons more, because those are counted in other sectors, right? So this is an accounting issue. So we're not double counting. The sequestration that happens in ag land forest is counted in the forestry sector, and the emissions from energy use on a farm are counted in the energy sector, okay? So the question is, can we reduce our emissions 40% by 2030? And what kinds of practices can we think across? So now I'm going to pivot conceptually. I've shown you what the sources of emissions are. And this is a grouping of sort of 5 different conceptual areas that we can consider for reducing our emissions. First is dairy, obviously. We could think about feed management, how to reduce the methane and nitrous oxide from feed systems, manure storage emissions, and milk production efficiency. How to increase the milk production and decrease the methane that comes from the cows. Another area would be for crops, how to manage the nitrogen or the soil carbon and the carbon nitrogen relationships. Woodlands, we have about 20% of our farmland is technically wooded in the state. So how could we improve that forest management, both for future generations to have high quality wood products, but also to sequester carbon? And how could we think about building out agroforestry systems that either add agriculture to existing forest systems or add trees to existing agricultural systems? We also have in the state between 2 and 4 million acres of quote unquote idle or underutilized or former agricultural land, which technically, right, if you remember one of my first slides, was former forest land since we were mostly a forested state. We could think about growing more trees on those underutilized or idle lands. We could put solar or wind energy on them, or we could grow biomass for feed or fuel. And then, of course, conservation is always one of the great tricks in our bag to reduce our energy or reduce our energy use, as well as conserve land so that it can be used for other things. So what Peter Woodbury and I did is we evaluated 13 practices based on those conceptual areas, and they're all listed here. I'm not going to go into each one of them. You can look at our 2020 white paper that I will share at the end. But we tried to build out this smart decision matrix because we need to think across land managers, the actual people who are managing the land, but also the policymakers who need to think about how we get these projects funded and implemented in a meaningful way. So how can we prioritize greenhouse gas mitigation alongside our other ecosystem goals? And so in order to do that, we came up with the smart decision matrix, where the S stands for services or co-benefits associated or disbenefits associated with a practice, right? When you make a change in practice, it doesn't always mean that it has beneficial co-benefits, right? Like sometimes you can have disbenefits from a choice. M stands for measurable, like what is the quantity of mitigation? Is it a small mitigation potential or is it a large mitigation potential? A stands for the cost to achieve that reduction. Is it super expensive to do or is it cheaper to do? How realistic is it to implement is what the R stands for. And what is the time frame of implementation? So, you know, that white paper that I'm going to share with you, it's like 60 pages, and I highly recommend you just skip to page 16 through 29 and work through that table. There's a lot of other great information in there, but it's meant to sort of be a comprehensive lay of the land of what's going on and the considerations. But if you're looking at what to prioritize, I do think that there's some great information in just pages 16 through 29 of that report. Okay, so just to recap on what we mean by services, this is the co-benefits from implementing a greenhouse gas mitigating practice. So I'm always thinking about how can we mitigate the most greenhouse gases? And then I'm looking at the co-benefits that are associated with it. So does it also have benefits to soil health? Does it improve community relations because it addresses odor? Does it provide an adaptation to climate change, meaning it allows extreme weather to infiltrate easier? Does it increase profitability of the farm? Does it improve air quality? Does it improve water quality? Alternatively, does it harm air quality or water quality? Does it increase biodiversity? Does it create a co-product of an energy resource to displace a fossil fuel? Right? So these are the kinds of things that go into the S part of the matrix. Measurable is to think about the estimated statewide greenhouse gas mitigation potential from a particular practice. And in part, this is unofficially the degree to which it is also verifiable, right? Because we can all do all kinds of things, but can we actually verify that this measurable activity is actually happening, right? It's one thing to measure or to quantify the amount of mitigation. It's another thing to ensure that it is a meaningful reduction throughout time for mitigation purposes. It also, okay, I'm not going to say that. A stands for achievable. So this has to do with the approximate cost for implementation. So we're always looking for anything that's under $130 per metric ton of CO2 equivalents. A metric ton is also a megagram. But this is just the cost for implementing it. Recognize that there are other kinds of costs that can happen in the state, which is maintenance costs that happen subsequently, costs to educate and administer, costs to measure, verify, or count informal registries, right? There's other kinds of costs, but we were just trying to think about the costs for implementing the project. R stands for realistic. And really what this has to do is it technically available? Do we think we have the capacity at this point to do it? How many acres could we engage if we had a sufficiently strong policy? What are the number of stakeholders? Is it like 500 stakeholders we have to work with, or is it like 50,000 stakeholders, right? Like how much of interpersonal activity needs to happen? Are there technical tools available to help us? And can we do it now, or do we need more research? So this is whether or not a practice gets a star for realistic, is how realistic is it to implement this project in the near term? And then of course, T stands for the time frame. So this could refer to the lifespan of the infrastructure. Does the infrastructure last 25 years? Or are the trees planted for a 100-year intentioned future? Or what happens if a farmer sells their property and a no-till funded project becomes tilled again, right? These are the kinds of things that we're thinking about in the time frame. And this has a relationship to how permanent does this mitigation really fulfill our goal of reducing greenhouse gases over time. So I'm now going to talk about our top 5 mitigation practices, and they were chosen because they cost less than $75 per metric ton. They represent real mitigation and permanent mitigation, which are very important to me. They can most can be directly verified, some are indirectly verified, and they all have a suite of wonderful co-benefits that make them have other reasons to do besides greenhouse gas mitigation. And some may increase production efficiency of New York State agriculture, which has many both environmental and financial benefits. So our top 5 based on our smart decision matrix has to do with livestock feed management, manure cover and flare to destroy methane, nitrogen use efficiency to reduce the nitrogen on the field, to reduce the nitrous oxide emissions, improve the management of the existing woodlands so that they're building out really strong, long-lived wood products. Right? Because if we can sequester that carbon in the forest now, future generations will be able to cut down those trees and make beautiful houses or furniture that live another 100 or 300 years in that furniture or in that house, and then allows the forest to grow new trees, right? So that is a very real possibility, as well as planting trees on idle lands and returning it to New York's original landscape. So the first one I'm going to talk about briefly is enteric emissions. So this opportunity we estimate to be about 2.3 million metric tons reduction. It would presumably have a cost savings because you're putting less feed into the cow and getting more milk out of the cow and less methane, or some variation on that. I don't mean to say that's always the case. Sometimes you put more feed into the cow, but the net reduction for the state per gallon of milk is reduced. Presumably, if you're more efficient with your feed efficiency, there's cost savings. However, in order to get that feed efficiency, you often have to hire a nutritionist. So that can cut into those cost savings. Many farms are doing it, so there's farmer-to-farmer communication, and fundamentally what this can mean is a reduce in land use rates that can be freed up to do other things because the feed efficiency is reducing the feed requirements and the land requirements for doing so. There are some barriers, upfront costs to the farmer. You need technical assistance. It's one thing to implement it and maintain it, right? Like it's a real management practice, and then sustaining that management practice. But there are many NRCS and New York State funded opportunities currently to help farmers do this. And so again, this is not changing the industry, it's just making the industry more efficient. And I do not have the slides today, but I just want to make a shout out to New York State livestock. They have done an incredible job already to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from enteric over this time course. The next thing I'm going to talk about is this light blue, which are the manure emissions that come from the livestock in the state. And one of the activities I like to advocate for is manure cover and flare. This is an image of a manure cover that you don't see the flare in this image, but the gas is released nearby and flared, and that methane is destroyed. So this is a large mitigation opportunity in New York State. We think it'd be about a 4 million metric ton reduction per year of CO2 equivalents at less than $25 per metric ton. There's a small stakeholder group of about 500 farms, and there are several co-benefits, including community relations for reduced odor, hauling costs and hauling weight on public roads, as well as hauling weight on fields and compaction, and increased water quality benefits and reduced labor, perhaps. There's existing programming with 75 or 85% cost share, and there's new federal funding, which I think will be 100% cost share, but with different kinds of reporting. And many farms have already implemented it, so there's farmer-to-farmer communication. There are some barriers. It's a relatively large cost, so there's an upfront cost to the farmer, even with a cost share, and will require engineering to retrofit existing storages. And of course, this is all, their ability to pay for it has to do with what the milk pricing is currently. And of course, it requires significant technical assistance. However, there is new policies out there to help farmers in New York State, and I think other states are thinking about this also. This is also formally covered under the federal NRCS programming for the new IRA climate resilient farming practices. Okay, the next one I'm going to talk about is nitrogen use efficiency, which is this green bar, and this is the nitrogen used on our field. This is a small mitigation opportunity of about 0.2 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents. But what's great about nitrogen use efficiency is it generally saves money, right? Because you're putting less nitrogen on and still getting the same yield. Your management is probably higher, and it's just following the existing 4R guidelines. So in a certain way, this is a continuation of our water quality practices that have been impacting our nitrogen emissions. Many farms are doing it already, so there's farmer-to-farmer communication, and there are some significant co-benefits like improved water quality and reduced upstream production, because synthetic nitrogen is really an energy-intensive emission that happens in the state that is producing that nitrogen. Some of the barriers is we need to think about the cultural shift away from insurance nitrogen. There's an upfront cost to the farmer for soil testing and planning. And also, it's probably more costly to consider precision nutrient management, but lots of folks are working on how to get those costs down in order to make that realistic and applicable. It requires some technical assistance and some consistent implementation and sustaining of that implementation. The next two are not about reducing emissions, but increasing the sequestration on our land base. And that is increasing the carbon sequestration in existing woodlands across the 1.4 million acres that farmers own in the state. So this is not forest ownership, this is farmers. And what's great about that is we all know farmers are really great managers. And so increasing the management of their forest, I think, is going to be both a long-term financial win as well as securing of a long-term carbon sequestration for the state. Due to time, I'm just going to move on. The other opportunity that we are advocating for is activation of these idle lands. I said before that we estimate that there's between 2 and 4 million acres. And when we say we estimate between 2 and 4 million acres, what we mean by that is we estimate that there are 4 million acres, but only half of those owners are going to want to do something differently. And so in thinking about getting not farmers, those landowners, to do something differently. So thinking about converting 1.7 million acres to long-lived wood products, there are many considerations for this afforestation agenda, including opportunity costs such as using that same land for solar, for wind, for bioenergy, for increased grazing, or for increased products, as well as climate change, changing pests, and we have a deer browsing issue in the state, which they love to eat up our little seedlings. So there are some significant barriers here, but it is something that I think we are equipped to do. So those are the top 5. Now I just want to compare and contrast how they fall out in the smart decision matrix. So here you can see on the left-hand side are 2 best management practices: manure cover and flare and biochar, as 2 different types of things that one could do on a farm. Here is the S, the systems co-benefits, the M, the measurable mitigation, the cost to achieve, realistic to implement, and the time frame of mitigation benefit. So you can see that both biochar and and manure cover and flare get a star for system co-benefits because there are many co-benefits to both of these practices. We think that manure cover and flare has a large mitigation potential, and it's easily verifiable with a meter and flare. Does that mean we've perfected it? No. Does it mean I think we can perfect it? Absolutely. Whereas biochar has a very large potential, but we feel that biochar needs more research before we actively put this on all of our agricultural land. And so that's why biochar does not get a star for realistic to implement, right? It's not that we can't do pilots and studies. It just means at this immediate moment, right, we are not prioritizing this as the top 5. That doesn't mean that isn't in the top 10 for the next generation of this work, right? Like, we think that the cost to achieve the manure cover and flare is under $25 per metric ton of CO2 equivalents. And we also know that we have it currently functioning in the state. Of course, there can be improvements. And this methane destruction is permanent, so it has a long-term mitigation potential, so it has a star. The only reason why biochar does not get a star here is because we need to think about the life cycle of the production of the biochar. That doesn't mean that we don't know that biochar can live for 100 years in soil. It's that we need to think about the net emissions over the entire life cycle of biochar so that we're not losing the benefit through the processing. So that just gives you an idea of how, you know, you can argue with our assumptions here, and that's great. That's exactly what we want to have happen. But when you look at pages 16 through 29, we try to outline it like this so that we're all thinking in a systems basis, and we're thinking about co-benefits and disbenefits, costs, and how long this mitigation would go on for. And again, I just want to stress, a 1 star doesn't mean it's not a good idea. It just means that it's not what we're prioritizing for various reasons. So can we reduce emissions? Okay, I'll be very fast. Can we reduce emissions 40% by 2030? On the left, you saw this before. These are our emissions totals. On the right, you can see the reductions that we estimate. Without including the farm woodlands, we estimate that we can reduce emissions about 12 million metric tons, which is about a 50% reduction of current emissions. Remember, we're supposed to do 40% below 1990 emissions, so this actually is a little unfair upcounting. So it's more like 37% below 1990 levels. But the point is we can do it for less than $75 a metric ton, and there's some great co-benefits that we're also getting. So yes, we can do it. We can totally reduce our emissions in agriculture. I want to make a few qualifiers. Remember, most of the problems occur in the other sectors: transportation, heat, and electricity, right? This blue chart. This is not ag's problem. This is an energy problem, and that involves all of us, right? We all need to think about it. We cannot point our fingers at agriculture. They're part of the problem, but so are we. In my opinion, agriculture will have a hard time delivering mitigation to those other sectors. It will need to just mitigate its own emissions. And that means the rest of us need to think about reducing our energy consumption emissions. And my qualifier number 2 is that the history of extension is largely based on a history of a large proportion of the population working in agriculture. And we need to remember that in 1850, 64% of the workforce was in agriculture, and now only 10%. And what I mean by that is that extension needs to really think about moving into other sectors to help the other sectors get those greenhouse gases down, because anything we do to reduce those emissions are fundamentally going to help agriculture, which is the one sector in society that is most impacted by a changed climate, right? The pests, the water, the drought, all of those kinds of things. So how we can activate extension to help everybody get an energy efficient refrigerator, weatherize their home, have a more efficient car, et cetera, is ultimately really going to help agriculture. And I just want us to remember the cooperative extension passage of the Smith-Lever Act in 1914. that cooperative agriculture extension work shall consist of the development of practical applications of research knowledge, instruction and practical demonstration of existing or improved practices or technologies in agriculture, uses of solar energy, 14, with respect to agriculture, home economics, and rural energy. So extension plays a very special role in helping us all reduce our emissions across farms, families, and communities. I'm going to skip the funds. I do want to say that there are a large number of climate smart commodity funds across the state, across the country that you can look at to find out the kinds of projects that are being funded federally. And yeah, I think I'm going to stop there. Questions, thoughts, considerations?
Yes, we do have one question in the chat. And of course, anyone can enter their questions in the chat or raise your hand to ask one verbally. The question in the chat is, what meters or metrics do you use to measure the greenhouse gases?
So every activity is different, and we do literature review. Sometimes we use default factors from the IPCC. This whole methodology was following the IPCC methodology. And so sometimes we have data from state reporting. Sometimes we get data from National Ag Statistics or the Census of Agriculture, right? There is not we do not nationally or anywhere in the world really have a real suite of activities to verify these mitigation practices at this time, right? This is a nascent field.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, I wondered, Jennifer, that was a fantastic presentation. It's great to hear what's happening in a neighboring state. I'm based in Vermont, so really appreciate how you presented the information and the framework and all the concepts, and also the optimism that it can be done. That was fantastic. I wondered what you thought of the COMET tool for helping with evaluation and setting targets. And
I don't love it. Here's what I think is going to happen. I think the comment tool is a great beginning space to think about things. I think all of these tools, anything we get people to think about the ecosystem at large and the interactions is really important. I think the comment tool is going to have lots of changes coming up, which I think will be healthy improvements of the comment tool. And I think at this point where most people are at, the comment tool is an appropriate beginning place. I do think New York State is really staying within the IPCC methodology. And what's really super about the IPCC methodology is it has 3 tiers. And most of our work for New York State agriculture is in tier 1 and tier 2. And tier 1 is really simple. It's like 1 cow times 1 factor. I mean, it's, tiny. Tier 2 is like, you think about the feed inputs or the milk outputs, and then you back calculate, right? There's these ways in which it gets better and better, and you can think about the temperature, and there are things that you can consider in tier 2. But what's so great about the IPCC having these methodologies is that as, like, say, a dairy farm state like New York builds out its tier 2 into its tier 3, that's going to be used on a state that has a smaller dairy. They don't have to do the research. They'll be able to, for example, Vermont could use, because you have a similar climate to New York State, you might be able to use the New York State factor that we develop in New York State because we've got more farms to choose from, but you're in the same ecozone. So I think what's really promising is that if everybody contributes to the IPC methodology whichever tier, I think collectively society is going to develop some really good regional specific numbers to get a greater understanding. That being said, remember that agriculture is like 6% of the emissions. And it is one of the hardest things to verify because you've got three interacting gases. Sometimes one goes down and two go up, and sometimes two go down and one goes up, and this one's multiplied by a lot, and these are multiplied by a little, and the math gets all complicated. But let's remember, ag is a small piece of the pie. It is our food source, right? And the energy sector is much easier to think through. So I don't know. I'm all about thinking about priorities. And I think the best thing for agriculture is for all of us to work on our energy consumption. That would be my favorite tool.
Last call for the poll, if you haven't filled that out, and the survey link is in the chat. The next question we see is from, oh, well, let me skip Reagan's question for just a moment. I'll come back to it, I promise. But you've referenced a report throughout the talk, and we've got a request for access to that report. I don't know if you can put it in the chat, or we can make sure it's included with the recording on the website or something like that.
So there's the report. It's the Smart Matrix report. I just stuck it in there. It's a PDF. You should be able to access. If you can't, just email jw93@cornell.edu. I also am going to put in some of the New York State content, and hopefully it'll let me do it. Some of the New York State reports. If you're in the North, if you're part of the Climate Alliance, or you want to learn about the Climate Alliance or the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is the Northeast, that's also a good resource. And then I'm going to put in our working website, which, you know, there's two of us, so it gets updated when it gets updated. And honestly, I had asked to present May 1st because I had wanted to give you an updated version of the report. It's not updated, so I can't give it to you, but I also put in the chat our NECI curriculum development working group. We also host a webinar series, and the next one is co-created materials. So it's thinking about forestry projects with women forest owners in Pennsylvania, and Latin co-created projects for climate change mitigation in Washington State. Those are next month's presentation. It's the fourth Wednesday at 3. And the following Wednesday at 3 is a presentation about aging and climate, how to think about addressing the impacts to our aging community, as well as thinking about how our elders in our community can really do a lot to help mitigate climate that occurred in their lifetime.
Okay. Now to Reagan's question, and then I did see David raise his hand temporarily. Reagan's asking if the numbers for New York State would be similar for other states in the US, particularly states where there may be, at least perceived to be, a lot more agriculture.
So every state needs to do its own inventory, and thankfully the US government has made an inventory for every state. The data that goes into that is less than perfect, right? So you have to have a certain amount of skepticism, but it'll still get you into the ballpark. So I think the first thing to do is look at the US greenhouse gas inventory report and pull out the data for your state. If you can't find the specific data, you can email the US EPA and get your state specific data. The second comment is, and I cannot believe I'm forgetting it, there is a tool where you can put in default numbers and do a simple inventory. And it does a very good beginning job. And in fact, I used to have slides where I had done it for the whole Northeast, right? Like I had done the estimates, and you could see that a livestock heavy state like New York, Pennsylvania, and Vermont had more methane emissions. And then a cropping heavy state like Maryland had more nitrous oxide emissions and less methane emissions. So I think in general, in a certain way, you don't, there's tools already out there. Did that answer your question? And then if you want to dig in, then you can do the IPCC methodology. And I just want to say that when you look at the IPCC methodology the first time, it is very large and very daunting. But what you need to do is you need to block out tier 2 and tier 3 and just stumble through tier 1. And that'll get you 9/10 of the way for your perception of your state inventory. And the state inventory tool, which is the SIT tool that I couldn't remember just a moment ago, basically follows that on its own. It just puts in some bad default numbers. And it would be wise to use that tool and double check the default numbers it puts in. David?
Yeah, this is maybe, I also see in the chat is Susie has a comment that's about the warming potential time frame, which is
Okay.
it's related to my question. Okay, so maybe you could look at both of those at once. So my question is, how much difference does the global warming potential time frame that's being used influence the practices which you would rate as being in the top 5 or not?
So I have many, I'm going to keep it to 2 points here. If we use the oldest global warming potential that was traditionally used, which is from the IPCC report number 4, which came out, I can't even remember when it came out. It was a long time ago, which means methane is 25 as opposed to 84. It will still be 70% of the emissions in New York State agriculture. So it's a difference between 70 and 89% comes from methane. And all that means is it doesn't mean anything. Functionally, it means we still need to tackle the methane. Okay, so when people start going off on the global warming potential, I just say, ignore it. It doesn't matter which global warming potential. If you're in a livestock state, you need to address methane. It's that simple. Second of all, if you look at our 2050 goal, it's to be net neutral. What I haven't told you all is that in New York State, in that policy, there is one exemption and one exemption only, and it is for livestock because they are animals. They are not machines. They are not things that you can control, and those are exempted. But even though livestock is exempted, which is the largest source of our emissions from agriculture, it's like almost half of our emissions is just from the burps and farts from those cows, okay? Even though that's exempt, the state has to reduce those emissions anyways in order to get to net neutral. So we have to grow more trees to compensate. And so in a certain way, it doesn't matter which global warming potential you have, because the goal is to be net neutral. And so I just think equivocating over the global warming potential is a dead idea. You can do it, but if you have livestock, you're still going to need to take care of your methane. It doesn't matter. I don't know. Does that answer your question? Or the question that's in the chat?
Mostly, I mean, but I'm just trying to get, I mean, I think it answers it from a policy perspective for sure. But you started out like with a lot of effort into sort of measuring effectiveness, and some states, as you pointed out, are still using a different one. So the answer to the question, I think, is it's not going to change the priorities for, it depends really much more upon, are you a state that grows crops or a state that grows, that sells milk and meat?
Correct. If you're a livestock state, you're going to have to deal with methane. It's going to be your majority problem. If you are a crop state, you need to deal with nitrous oxide. And the global warming potential is kind of a moot point. It just helps you, help you recognize its importance. That's all.
Okay. In the interest of time, Mark has been waiting very patiently for an answer to his question in the chat. And then we will totally go over to you, Paul. But let's make these quick if we can. Mark is saying he was at a celebration and he heard that an algae had been found that can fix nitrogen. Have you heard this, and what might be the nitrogen benefits of incorporating that into future plant breeding?
Well, nitrogen, okay, remember nitrogen is I'm gonna punt on this, Mark. I don't know that I can genuinely answer. I think this is a great speculation, but I don't know, right? Because once the nitrogen is there, it then can turn into nitrous oxide. Nitrogen's a very tricky thing to mitigate. And so, a legume crop generally puts off more nitrogen, even though you're not using the greenhouse gases to make the synthetic nitrogen. So it just changes where the emission is happening. So it's tricky. Nitrogen is super tricky, and I'm not even going to try to give you a true answer because it's tricky.
All right, Paul, finish us up.
I'll be super quick. I know we're past the top of the hour. Jennifer, great information as usual. Just so appreciate all of this, the detail and the great information. I hope we could post this the slide deck because there's so much good detail in and graphs in this. So 2 questions. One of them's kind of rhetorical, and I guess I'm wondering, one of your main points is we've got to reduce emissions, and I'm just wondering if, what are your thoughts on Extension's role in kind of advocating for really the greatest act that any of us can do in terms of reducing emissions is to limit our family sizes. So just wondering if you care to weigh in on if Extension can and should kind of have any information about that. Maybe not advocating, but just providing that information about carbon footprint of family size. And the second question is, what can we do? Any suggestions in terms of what our own units can do, whether it's at the county level, at the state level, et cetera, in terms of inventorying our emissions, and having plans to specifically short-term goals in terms of our university footprints and reducing emissions, and how we can apply some of the good information that you offered for kind of walking the talk.
As usual, Paul, you give humdingers of questions. I think the greatest tool in our toolkit in the United States, not everywhere in the United States, is that we are a fiercely inefficient country. And so our population in this country is going down, but our consumption is going up. So I don't think it has to do with family size. It has to do with making ourselves energy efficient. If you look at the chart for New York, right, it's like this much energy consumption and this much waste and this much agriculture, right? So I think the greatest role for Extension is not that I'm trying to abandon agriculture. I'm not interested in abandoning agriculture because it is our life source. But to really help agriculture and everybody at large, we need to pivot to energy efficiency of homes and doing it equitably so that the poor in our community can have less costly energy consumption, both financially and in terms of greenhouse gases. So nobody really wants to pivot in that direction because but I do think that the issue is fundamentally, how do we encourage local renewable energy and local energy efficiency in order to reduce that largest piece of the pie? Because if we take care of that, we're going to reduce the impact on climate, and that's going to be the greatest benefit to agriculture, is a more sustainable climate as opposed to a more erratic climate. So the sooner we can deal with that, the better off we are. And then I think the other thing is what I'm trying to stress in this smart decision matrix, which I hope people use, not just for the 13 items that we have listed there. You can use it for anything, right? To compare and contrast and then prioritize your finite resources in your municipality or in your university unit or however, or on your farm, in order to get the largest meaningful reduction per unit cost, right? Because I think that there are some ag projects that are being advocated for that are far more expensive than if we just changed out the refrigerators in our town, for example, right? I mean, And I think we need to get to that. We need to think across sectors to think about the lowest cost, highest real mitigation. And in a way, it's a really beautiful moment because everybody's ideating about all the possible ways in which you can change the climate. In fact, if I turn right, I will change the climate. If I turn left, I will change the climate. Like there's all kinds of ways. But what we need to work on is how to prioritize the lowest hanging fruit with the greatest benefit at the lowest cost amongst and between sectors in order to get that bar chart down and down and down most cost effectively and most quickly.
All right, everybody. We're 5 minutes over time, so let's go ahead and call it a good, solid, well-taught webinar from Jennifer today. Thank you for sharing with us. And Paul, you never get the final question again. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.